My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. The Spanish word Camino may be translated as path, road, or way. The Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, is a pilgrimage route that runs through southern France and northern Spain. When my guest this week on Destination Unlimited, trekker, writer, and anthropologist Beebe Bahrami made her first full 500-mile hike on the Camino de Santiago, she learned that this way was more than a Christian pilgrimage. She discovered that beneath this 1,200-year-old pilgrimage road was a more ancient, pre-Christian initiatory path that could take one deeper into spiritual experience and consciousness, and that images relating to the wild goose and sacred feminine mark the path of initiation. Her website is beebebahrami.weebly.com, and she joins me this week to share her amazing path and latest book, The Way of the Wild Goose, 3 pilgrimages following geese, stars, Hunches, and the Camino de Santiago. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Beebe Bahrami. Welcome, Beebe.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, Victor.
And wonderful for you to join us and share your amazing experiences and body of work. But let's start with your early path and how it led to your calling. You grew up in Colorado, a state that many of my generation in the 60s and 70s thought of as paradise. Tell us about Colorado and how it inspired your path.
Well, I was born and raised in the 60s and 70s in Colorado, right there at the Front Range in Boulder, Colorado. So I know what you're speaking of. To grow up in that milieu was definitely a huge influence in opening my mind to the world being an incredibly diverse place that has many paths and so much beauty, so many possibilities. I also, had the fortune of growing up in a bilingual and bicultural household. And so I grew up speaking 2 languages, understanding that there were 2 cultures, at least in my most immediate sphere. And growing up in a place like Boulder also taught me that, we're all existing in our own culture, but there's this interconnection, this interesting place where they all meet. So a pretty great upbringing. And to be able to also be at the foot of nature, like that, in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and to from the moment I could walk, being able to go hiking in such immense raw beauty was also a huge influence.
And what was your spiritual background, or did you have one?
I did. I had as varied a background as the place that I was born and raised. Both my parents were very broad in their outlook of spirituality and religion, and there are many religious faiths in my own family. And my family background is Iranian, but in that background is Armenian and Zoroastrian and Jewish and Muslim. And so I really, looked for the universal truths in all of those faiths, and went to preschool at the Unitarian Church in Boulder. I was married in the Unitarian Church in Boulder. And I would say the most dominant spiritual influence was that my father was a great lover of music, and it was mystical to him. Music was the mystical vehicle. And he really spoke of music as this transcendent medium, and taught me how to listen and journey with music. And my mother was the same with poetry, especially mystical poetry, such as the likes of Sadi and Hafez and Rumi, as well as the poets who wrote in English. So I grew up with all that, and I would probably say my strongest spiritual background is as a nature mystic, a great devotee of the earth's immense beauty and a reverence and honoring of that.
Tell us about the science of cultural anthropology, and why did you pursue this?
I pursued it because it was a way of answering a lot of questions in my curiosity about the world. I first came from a background as an undergraduate at the University of Colorado, studying very broadly a liberal arts degree, but I focused on molecular biology and earned a degree in molecular biology. But in my last semester, I really realized I wanted to go into more the humanities and social sciences and explore my curiosity about other cultures and languages and history and archaeology and folklore, and as well as where humanities and science intersect. And so really all my advisors said, there's one discipline that will do all that, and that's anthropology.
That's
and
wonderful.
Yeah, it's a terrific training and background because it really gave me the tools I needed to explore the many strands of one thing, whether it was through, literature and science intersecting or going down the same rabbit hole. It really gave me the tools to be able to pursue something.
Absolutely. Your writing career began with travel and adventure. What were your first books and what inspired them?
Mm-hmm. My first books were, should say my first real break was while I was finishing my PhD in anthropology. I really realized that I didn't want to be an academic writer. I wanted to write for a broader audience. I wanted to write in the active voice and really pull people into the rich material that I was finding. And a colleague of mine knew this, and she heard that National Geographic Books was looking for authors of chapters in a book called Peoples of the World. And they needed somebody to write about North Africa and the Middle East, and that was something that I could do. And I got that gig, worked with a wonderful editor at National Geographic. And soon after that coffee table book came out, I was also, I got a contract to update guidebooks for Michelin Green Guides, and their French titles and some American titles. And then the real break was of my own book, the full-fledged, first non-academic, but academically grounded book was The Spiritual Traveler Spain from Paulus Press, because they knew I was an expert on the Iberian Peninsula and wanted somebody to write an ecumenical, broad book on the sacred sites and pilgrimage routes of Spain. Yeah.
And as you mentioned, your style of writing and storytelling pulls the reader alongside you, offering a presence and visceral experience. How did this style of writing manifest for you?
In a lot of ways, part of it was that desire to, academic writing is, academic knowledge is so important, but academic writing can be a real barrier to most people of really diving into subject matter and understanding it. And I kept wondering, how does a person bring the reader in and get out of the way? And one of the things I learned as an anthropologist is the first thing you do is you let the material speak for itself. You get out of the way and you follow the breadcrumbs the material is giving you and go in the direction of the material. And then I also learned from one of my great loves is travel literature, especially the classics, the old explorer going off into the unknown and writing about it. And I read a lot of classic travel literature and realized that people were doing this already from the, Herodotus and probably before, of taking the reader right in to the place and the action and the people and the conversations. And even though they were the vehicle, they are not in the way of themselves. And I really wanted to find that balance and worked at it and knew that you can find a really fine balance where you can write in the first person and you can be the vehicle of transport for the reader, but you can also get out of the way so the reader starts feeling and experiencing it for themselves. And when you hit that sweet spot, you just keep rolling with it.
And you have certainly hit that sweet spot. Before we discuss your latest book, The Way of the Wild Goose, let's discuss two cafes, Cafe Oak and Cafe Neanderthal. Why cafe in the titles?
Those came about from my serendipitous landing in southwestern France through really following a tug of my heart and trusting the unknown road, and through a hurricane-like storm across northern Spain into southwestern France, and something like 4 trains and 1 bus later, landing in Sarlat-la-Canéda in winter, in January, a few years ago. I think it was 2009, actually, and falling in love with this place that had everything that I loved. It had pilgrimage routes. It had ancient prehistory. I mean, this is one of the highest concentrated areas for prehistory in Europe, for Neanderthal and early modern humans, or what we call Cro-Magnon. And I just landed there, and doors started opening up, as if the place and the people were saying, "You've come home." And I'd never experienced anything like that, of a real sense of homecoming at a spiritual level. And one of those doors that opened was one evening I read in the local newspaper that there was this group of locals who met once a month at a cafe. At the time it was called the Le Berrou Cafe, named after an old mythic werewolf-like creature of the Dordogne. And they met once a month at this cafe to practice speaking Occitan, the old Romance language of the south of France, that's still very much alive and spoken by people, especially in the countryside. And they called themselves Café Oc, and Oc in Occitan means yes. And I was just thinking, what a fabulous idea. And I don't speak Occitan, but I do speak Spanish and French, and Occitan, you can understand it a little bit if you know a Romance language, because it is a Romance language. So I just took a chance, and I thought, oh, well, I want to just go see if I can sit in and listen and learn from these folks. And I pushed open the door into that cafe on a blustery, cold winter night, and I had a dozen people immediately welcoming me with such warmth, and they pulled me in, and they said I was so welcome. And I started not only learning rudimentary Occitan, but I started learning that that's the language that the old stories and the old lifeways of the southwest of France are still told. And if you only speak French, you're going to miss some of the deeper stories and the deeper roots. And there are ideas and words that only exist in Occitan to this day. And so Café Oc, I wrote, it's like a love letter to the Dordogne in the southwest of France, and to these people who opened their lives to me and really wove me into it and taught me this deep-rooted life that has a continuity back to prehistory. And it was through that prehistoric connection of this region that one day in the market in Sarlat, the farmer's market, I was buying shallots, and out of the corner of my eye, my archaeology professor from graduate school, Harold Dibble, flitted across the square and then disappeared. And I hadn't seen him for years. And I was thinking, and that was in Philadelphia. And I thought, my God, what's he doing here? And if he's here, something interesting is happening in archaeology. And I chased him down, and we reconnected. And it turned out he was opening up a really well-known Neanderthal site called La Ferracie that had been occupied by Neanderthals around 90,000 years ago. And his team was going to open it up and commence new excavations there. And he invited me to be a part of that. And I wound up writing a book on it, and I called it Café Neanderthal for many reasons, because so much of the work of archaeology in the southwest of France happens around a cafe table or a dinner table, and all the discussions were happening then. And what they're trying to reconstruct of our ancestors, Neanderthals, was similar. What did they eat? What did they talk about? How did they get along? What were their relationships like? So, and on top of that, in the market days, when you go to a cafe and you sit down with a bunch of locals, it's very likely that prehistory will be a topic of conversation. And as I was getting more and more involved in the archaeological dig, my local friends were really curious about what was going on and what we were finding. And it always happened at a cafe table. So Cafe Neanderthal.
Who were the Neanderthals and what might we learn from them?
Oh, we can learn so much from them. For one thing, they are our closest evolutionary cousins that we know of to date. We overlap with them in time, in certain places. We know that we're related to them in a deep ancestry, that probably we came from a common ancestor that split off probably around 600,000 years ago. And, our, Homo sapiens mostly roamed around Africa, and that distant ancestor, left and explored Asia and Europe. And some of those, common ancestors evolved into Neanderthals. And, sometimes, we met in places like the Levant in Israel. It's a crossroads of three continents. And we were still interbreeding and able to have children with each other. So it speaks very much of this diversity of being human, but still so similar that we're still, one species, and that there are many ways of being human. What we can learn from them is, all prior humans, other than us, Homo sapiens, really lived in similar ways. They lived in ways that is, the big aha moment in Cafe Neanderthal was when I really realized that other than us modern humans, all other humans who have walked this earth have lived with the earth. They've adapted to the earth. And we Homo sapiens are forcing the earth to adapt to us. And this is the big difference. And it's a significant one because we're now in a climate crisis. We've cut up the earth. We've exploited it to the point it's not in balance. And we're the only species that has succeeded in doing this. So that's a bit of a low. The high is, what can we learn from Neanderthals, is that we do come from this incredibly deep and rich inheritance. And there are many ways of living on the earth, and we have all of those within us.
Absolutely. You had mentioned feeling at home when you arrived there. Do you have a sense of reincarnation? Were you living there in the past?
I wondered about that because it was really as if this was a familiar place. And I've had that feeling before. Had it when I was a study abroad student in college in Seville in southern Spain as well, but nothing as pronounced and strong as the feeling I got when I arrived in southwestern France and in Sarlat. And it's a possibility, but when I talk to friends about this, locals in the Dordogne, who, I said, I just get this feeling. And they said, you're not alone. There are a lot of people who come here and feel it. And some of them said, it could be reincarnation. And it also could be that humanity has existed here for a long time without a break. It's been continuous. From the earliest remains there are about 400,000 years old, and humans have been traversing that landscape ever since. And almost pretty much, I spoke to the late archaeologist Randall White, who sadly passed this summer. And he was telling me he did a survey where he went and he was looking at all the prehistoric sites on the landscape in the Dordogne region. And he said that it's pretty much a guarantee that anywhere you have a medieval village, underneath it is a prehistoric site. And he's saying not even, not as recent as Neolithic, the early farmers about 9,000 years ago. But he said, I'm talking early Homo sapien, Paleolithic, and I'm talking probably Neanderthal. These are just places that were very appealing to people. So locals said you could just be feeling the morphic resonance of the ancestors. So it could be both.
You had mentioned studying microbiology. Do you think that there's a genetic memory?
I do, and biology is bearing this out with evidence in epigenetic studies. the proteins that are non-genetic, but that are bound to DNA, to genetic material that can turn on and off genes. And that there seems to be a correlation with things that our ancestors experienced that get coded in that epigenetic material that is still can express itself. So I think in that sense, and scientifically, yes, I do.
That would be wonderful if we could go in there and somehow get in touch with that information, open up that hard drive within our DNA and experience all of these lives that we've lived, huh?
Yeah. I think biology will eventually open those doors in its own unique way. But I think the shamans have already been doing it. And there's some really interesting documented studies about, tapping into the genetic code and on a shamanic journey.
Absolutely. My guest is Beebe Bahrami. Her book is called The Way of the Wild Goose, 3 Pilgrimages Following Geese, Stars, and Hunches on the Camino de Santiago. Beebe, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you and your amazing work.
Sure. Thank you. Listeners can find my books pretty much anywhere. They love to buy books at their favorite local bookstore or online. And if you just go to your favorite search engine and type in my name, my website will appear at the very top with all the places that sell my books.
And we'll be back with more of Beebe after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The cutting edge of conscious radio, OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Beebe Bahrami. Her book, The Way of the Wild Goose. Beebe, I remember growing up in the 1950s, hearing Frankie Lane singing a song written by Terry Gilkyson entitled The Cry of the Wild Goose. The lyric began, "My heart knows what the wild goose knows. I must go where the wild goose goes. Wild goose, brother goose, which is best? A wandering foot or a heart at rest?" What inspired your latest book, The Way of the Wild Goose?
Well, that was beautiful, beautiful lyrics, because it really speaks to how the goose is present in so many ways in our lives. And, the goose came into my life when I really devoted myself to walking and studying and writing about the Camino de Santiago, the great pilgrimage route, not only across northern Spain to the holy shrine of St. James the Greater in northwestern Spain, but really a network of roads all across Europe destined for that northwest spot in Iberia. And several times as I started walking the Camino de Santiago, especially the most historic route that runs from the French Pyrenees and starts in the town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port and makes its way over the mountains and across northern Spain on the Camino Frances, or the French way, I was meeting European pilgrims, especially French and Spanish, who would speak about being on a deeper spiritual, esoteric path than just the medieval Christian pilgrimage route. And I was intrigued, and I asked them what that meant. And they said, well, you have to walk in trust and faith, which is something that the Christians do as well, but that you look for signs, and you kind of can tell if it's a sign for you, something to stop and pay attention to. And I said, well, what do you mean by signs? And one of them said, well, there's the footprint of the goose. And I thought, wow, what is that? I mean, that sounds weird and fun and intriguing. And he said, well, I can't tell you because you have to find out for yourself what that means. So it kept coming up. And I started finding literature, especially in French and in Spanish, about the goose footprint, and the goose itself as a sign and symbol and guide and guardian on the pilgrimage road to Santiago de Compostela. And I just was intrigued by it, though it still made no sense and it still seemed bizarre, and but it kept appearing, and more. Once you focus on something, then you start seeing it more. And on the Camino de Santiago, there are indeed places that have geese and ducks, which I soon learned are equated as you can really take them as representing the goose sign as much as a goose. I found them engraved on medieval churches, especially the Romanesque churches from the 11th and 12th century, and started looking into their meaning and found that the stonemasons were using them to represent many things. One being a messenger between heaven and earth, another being a messenger of the divine, another being these guides and guardians who bring these waterfowl characteristics to the path that, waterfowl are special in their own category because, unlike many other birds, they are masters of the earth, of the water, and of the air. And they're, in the Middle Ages, were equated, pilgrims were sometimes considered being like geese and ducks, these migratory animals that appeared and disappeared during the certain seasons, that stuck together in groups, that looked out for each other, that were hell-bent on getting to their destination no matter what the conditions were. These were all qualities of geese, ducks, and pilgrims. And so it just kept piling up. And then I discovered that there was also this trend on the Camino de Santiago, that this game, a children's game in Europe called the Game of the Goose, was also being called a metaphor for the Camino and for life. And that didn't make sense at all. The Game of the Goose is like a game of chance with dice, with 63 squares that you throw your dice, you move your game piece, and you try to get to the 63rd square. And if you land an exact number, you win. On these 63 squares, 13 of them are geese. They're lucky squares. There are other squares that have ordeals on them. And so I started realizing, okay, I can see how that's a metaphor for the Camino, because the Camino has its gifts and its ordeals, and so does life. But then when I saw a Game of the Goose board game inlaid in human scale size on a square in Logroño, a third of the way on the Camino de Santiago across northern Spain, right on the Camino, and the square was the Plaza de Santiago. So I suddenly realized, okay, this whole goose game, this goose thing, and the Camino are all being woven as one. It's not just this thing I hear every now and then. It's a thing. And I started pursuing it more and more, and finally decided, after many years of walking the Camino, I need to devote one Camino to just looking for signs of the goose. And it wound up taking 3 dedicated Caminos in southern France and northern Spain to really unravel the whole story as best as I could fit it together, of what does the goose have to do with pilgrimage and initiatory spiritual journeys and the Camino de Santiago. And all the while I was thinking, this is an intellectual pursuit. I just want to put together the history and the mystery from the Middle Ages and have it make sense. What I didn't expect was that I was going to become one of the initiates, that it happened to me just by following the signs and looking for them. I became a seeker on this quest of the wild goose.
And on the cover of your book, The Way of the Wild Goose, you have that game, and it's beautiful.
Yes, that it's a modern board game, a rendition of the game of the goose. And it is set within an archway. It's a photograph that I took of one of the Romanesque doorways, the sort of half-moon arches, at a church of Morlas in southwestern France that had, when I really couldn't believe it when I stood before it and saw that on one of the rungs of the arch were 26 ducks, 13 going up one side and 13 going up the other side, and the two in the middle at the very apex of the arch are kissing. And I realized, okay, and that church was built in the 11th and 12th centuries. So that's when it really sealed it. That, wow, this is something that definitely goes back to the Middle Ages. It's not just modern pilgrims from France and Spain.
And tell us about the connection with Mother Goose.
Yeah, that was another one of the strands of evidence that I was unearthing and following. Was as I was looking for signs of the goose, I started noticing that there is a rich folklore in southern France, in northern Spain, and really extending into parts of Germany and into Scandinavia and into Eastern Europe, of these goddesses, in Greece and Rome as well, of goddesses associated with geese, ducks, and swans. And many listeners, I'm sure, are already putting some together, like Juno, the Roman goddess. You know, her animal is the goose. Freya, her animal is the swan. And I started, and it was Jacob Grimm of the Brothers Grimm, in a work of scholarly collection of Teutonic mythology, where he commented that there seems to be a connection between these goddesses, especially ones who seem to have waterfowl feet. And he mentions La Reine Pédoc. It's Occitan, it's from southern France, and it's the name of it literally means goose-footed queen. And that she seemed to be a female divinity, a mother goddess, mother earth character that survived in southern France. And he thought that she was this one and the same as a German goddess who was Percha, who also has waterfowl feet, and associated also with Scandinavian waterfowl-footed goddesses. And I was finding folklore also in northern Spain that had female divinities with waterfowl feet. And I realized that this is probably an old native indigenous European goddess that existed before Christianity, very much earth-based, the goddess of people who are fishers and hunters and gatherers and farmers and herders, who are living very closely to the earth and honoring her, and making offerings to the earth, and knowing the earth's rhythms and seasons and natures, and the way we used to live, really, quite honestly, before we separated ourselves from nature through all our technologies, as well as through our religious systems that moved the god from the earth to the sky. And so I was just really putting all of this together, and one of the characters that showed up that was speaking of holding on and surviving and trying to keep this earth grounded sacred system intact with all that was going on to dislodge it, was Mother Goose. And Mother Goose was the more recent incarnation of the mother goddess, of the goose goddess, as I call her, who found a way to safely survive. It's really hard to persecute Mother Goose. She's just so sweet, and she cares about us, and she tells us these great stories, and she sits by the fire and she spins her flax or her wool. And these are all qualities of the old goddess, with her spindle and spinning, sitting by the fire, sitting by a cave opening, sitting by running stream of water. And sometimes if you look in the water, you'll see her feet are duck or goose feet.
Mm. Did you get a sense through this of what caused the transition from the feminine divine, from the matriarchal, to the masculine divine and the patriarchal?
Yeah, I think it's so easy to risk oversimplifying it, but I think it really goes back to the more and more we started altering the earth for our sustenance, instead of going from being hunters and gatherers and reading the earth and following the animals and following the cycles, to starting to domesticate, and with domestication starting to claim territory that became a permanent home, so moving from nomadism to sedentarism, to growing our own food, to domesticating and owning animals, owning crops, owning property. This sense of ownership, I think, is a big piece in it's the first separation between us and the web of life that we're from, this sort of sense of entitlement that I own something. And it just, with it comes many more manipulations of the natural world towards accruing more and more security, wealth, influence, power. And so, it's the risk of oversimplifying, but the more such a system as this kind of ownership and altering of the earth takes place, the further away from nature we get. And the more, we build societies on this idea of the accumulation of wealth and resources, even at the cost of distorting the balance or disturbing the balance of life. And anybody who says, no, we need to return to balance, we need to honor the earth, we need to worship the earth, is kind of, people in power who want to keep their power might look at that and say, that's not in my interest, and want to cut it off at the knees. So I think, all the, if you really look at the witch hunts of the early modern era, these were manifestations of, one more way to cut off the voice of people who keep reminding others that we're all interconnected, that the earth matters, that everyone has to be included.
Now, the Camino being a magical place, is there evidence of the appreciation of the spiritual mother by people who live along the Camino?
There definitely is. There definitely is. For one thing, it's still very much an economy that if people are not living from serving the pilgrimage, they are herders and farmers, wine growers. They're still, they're planting and they're aware of the seasons and they're dependent on the rain, or, there have been severe droughts. So people are very much aware and of the earth and her cycles, and they do equate this with the Mother Earth, and people even refer to the Mother Earth in that way. But there's also a long continuity of this idea of the Camino as having this very strong feminine divine presence, and that is in all the chapels all along the Camino route that are devoted to Mary. And she is the one divinity above all others, including Saint James, to whom this road is devoted, or to Jesus, the whole reason for Christianity. She is the one divinity most revered and honored in all these chapels. And the locals are very much aware of the origin stories of these chapels, and they know that they go back to, there are all these marvelous legends and discovery stories about these chapels devoted to Mary that speak about, a king hunting in the Nájera region, now today of La Rioja. He in 1044, he went hunting and his falcon took off and disappeared in a thicket of trees. And he went and parted the thicket of trees and found himself against this red cliff stone. And there was a cave. And he figured the falcon must have disappeared in the cave, followed the falcon in, and found that the falcon had pursued a dove, and the dove had also gone in the cave. But the two were now seated peaceably beside each other on either side of an icon of Mary.
Mm-hmm.
And that shrine, he built a shrine in her honor right there, and that icon is still in that cave. And then a whole church grew up around that. There's another place where an icon to Mary was found floating down the river near Logroño, and they picked up, she was the river goddess, and people are just aware of these Marys appearing in natural places that they then built a chapel in her honor. And by building that chapel in her honor, the icon stays there. There's a story of a spring that emerged right next to a recently built church in the 12th century in Leborero, this village on the Camino in Galicia in northwestern Spain, where villagers saw this beautiful spring just suddenly emerge from the ground, but that it emitted this glorious perfume during the daytime, and at night this light from within. And they finally started excavating around the spring and found the most beautiful image of Mary they had ever seen.
Mm.
And they took this image and they cleaned it, and they put the statue on the altar of their recently built church. And the next night they found that the statue had gone back to the spring.
Wow.
And they took it and put it back on the altar. And the next night it went back to the spring. This kept happening until finally a stonemason said, I think if I were to engrave an image of Mother Mary on the tympanum of our church, maybe the image from the fountain will stay on the altar. And sure enough, he did, and she did.
Mm.
But even to this day, by the writing of a Spanish writer that I really admire, Juan Atienza, to this day, some villagers say that sometimes at night, they'll still see Mary, the image from the church, seated at the water's edge. And some of them say she's combing her hair. And that's another one of these things from the old folklore of these water divinities with bird feet from northern Spain. One of the things she does is she combs her hair. And her hair is seen as an extension of her nerve endings of the Great Mother going out into her creation. And the combing is putting order to it, making sure all is well in her realm. So, there's definitely a strong awareness of the feminine divine on the Camino, and it is continued through these stories that continue to have life and vibrancy for locals.
Her latest book, The Way of the Wild Goose, will be back with more of Beebe Bahrami after these words on the OMTimes radio network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
They are our love bugs and companions. They are our pets, our family, and they make life better. When we face unexpected challenges, so do our pets. That's why we're on a mission to support people and their pets. Whether donating a bag of kibble, sharing an Instagram post of a lost cat, or welcoming a foster pet into your home, every bit of kindness counts. Visit petsandpeopletogether.org to learn how to be a helper in your community. Brought to you by Maddie's Fund, the Humane Society of the United States, and the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Beebe Bahrami, her book, The Way of the Wild Goose. Do you have a sense that Western culture may once again be ready to honor and embrace the essence of feminine divine? And how may women and men both embrace that path?
I definitely have a sense we're already doing it. because more and more people are interested, more and more people are transcending the conventional sacred systems that they grew up in, and saying there's this bigger picture within and beyond them. And I'm especially seeing it. I'm seeing it in all generations, to be honest. But I think that there's this understanding that, and this is really men and women, there's this understanding that it's not just honoring and embracing the feminine divine that has been given a back seat or suppressed, but it's also it's honoring the masculine divine that has also been distorted by a system of global patriarchy that just doesn't serve men and women at all. And as we honor the many manifestations of being human in all its gender expressions, we find that the wild masculine divine has been as silenced as the feminine divine, and it's coming back to the surface. And we're seeing it, I think, especially with younger generations who are saying, what is it with this incredibly polar definition of gender? I mean, it makes no sense. And it really doesn't. I mean, if you really study the natural world and you study human expression, we have the whole expression of male and female within us, every single person. And all life forms express this in such diverse ways that I think that awareness is more and more out there and on the surface.
You've had the opportunity to walk the Camino, 3 times now?
That's just for the pursuing the Goose. I've probably walked routes of the Camino over 45 times.
Wow. Many of us will never have the opportunity to walk the Camino, but may we share this connective experience in our everyday lives?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the magic of the Camino, I mean, it is definitely a holy road, and it has so many sacred sites on it. And I've learned through walking it so many times that really everywhere we are is holy. And if we walk with awareness and presence and attention to the details, we put our phone down and we just pay attention to each footstep, the pressure under our foot meeting the earth, stepping forward, looking, listening, watching the trees, watching the grass, taking a deep breath of air. All of this brings us into presence that makes us more aware of what's around us, and we will start noticing special things in the environment where we all are living. I mean, a wonderful way of walking the Camino right where you are is to every day go for a walk. I learned this during the pandemic, and I took everything I learned from the Camino when I couldn't go anywhere and I was just confined at home. I took the lessons from the Camino and I said, what would happen if for the next 5 months I walk the exact same path every day with incredible awareness? And what will happen? And I started noticing that the world around me, the rocks and the trees and the sand and even the buildings, started telling me their stories. I stopped being the center of everything, and I started noticing the stories all around me and the many voices all around me. And I started learning from my environment, and I started identifying certain rocks and certain trees as holy to me. And they would be, in the old days, they would be where I would go and make an offering, put down a stone or a little, dribble of whiskey, So we can definitely walk a holy path wherever we are. And all it takes is presence and just one foot in front of the other.
Is this what you experienced as trail magic?
Yes. Yes, there's, that uncanny synchronicity, or some people would call coincidence, that happens, that pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago speak a lot about all the time. It's just trail magic. I was thinking about this and I met someone who had the answer to it, or was dealing with the same thing, or I was thirsty and somebody offered me a bottle of water, or I was hungry and somebody said, hey, you want an orange? I have an extra orange. Or I needed a place to sleep and I couldn't find anything. And then somebody said, do you need a place? All these sorts of things. People would say, wow, it's trail magic. That's part of the magic of the Camino. And it is. But I think that trail magic happens right here and now. Again, if we are walking in that same way of being very present, just simplifying everything to the basics. When you walk the Camino, you're just carrying what you need in your backpack, and you're eating, you're sleeping, you're walking. That's it. And if we were to just dial it back to that simplicity and be present and pay attention, we'll find that there are doors and windows open all around us. And if we see it, and walk through it, we will say, wow, that was synchronicity. That was trail magic. I needed something and it just appeared. And I think it's always there. We just have to open, our perceptions more. And the way to do it is to not be afraid, to not live in fear, but to live in trust.
And that leads to the question, you learned to trust your intuition, to listen to that inner voice more after all these experiences that you had. What would you offer to our listeners about trusting their intuition?
Yes, again, another beautiful lesson of the Camino, because every time I listened to it, it really guided me well. And everyone knows the feeling. What I would say is, when you feel something, hear something, see something, register where it's hitting you. If it's, and where that place in your body is that it hits you, and it's truth. For me, it's right there in the heart center, and I can just feel like when somebody says something and I know it's the right thing, or I look at something and say that's the direction I want to go and it's the right thing. It's this wonderful feeling right there in the heart center. And when it doesn't feel right, it's kind of more like a gut clench, or just a little like a frog in the throat. And I just, it's just paying attention to those things and reading why you're registering it that way, and taking your time to make a decision that really feels right is a good way to follow your intuition.
Of all of your travels, have you found a place that you might consider your spiritual home?
Definitely. The Sarlat in the Dordogne of southwestern France was really the place that I've experienced that, and I keep experiencing it every time I go back. And also the Camino de Santiago, the whole road, and tributaries of it also run through Sarlat. So it's more like this network that I would call my spirit's home, that emanates from southwestern France and crosses over the Pyrenees and across northern Spain.
What would you like readers to take away from The Way of the Wild Goose?
There's so much, but to really have fun and follow your curiosity, even if it seems like it's going down a funny rabbit hole, and get out there and trust that the world is a more magnificent place than we might think about it from our homes or our houses, but also that the earth is this magnificent place that really, this is really the biggest takeaway, that really benefits and deserves our attention again, to revere it and take good care of it. Because all our old stories have spoken about this old earth wisdom of being sacred, and that we are a part of it. And I think that also shows us that we're a part of each other, and we're this interwoven web. And if we take good care of it, we're going to be in really good shape.
I remember the lyrics to an old Moody Blues song, Through the Eyes of a Child. It says, through the eyes of a child, you must come out and see that your world's spinning round, and through life you must be a small part of a whole of a love that exists With the eyes of a child, you will see. We have to reopen our children's eyes, don't we?
Yes, that's beautiful.
Absolutely. What's next for Beebe Bahrami?
What's next? Well, I will always be returning to the southwest of France and to the Camino and unearthing more of the stories. Right now, I'm going even more deeply into the folklore because it's this rich living folklore that I've encountered nowhere else in the world, and it has more stories to tell. So I'm really getting into that.
My guest is Beebe Bahrami. Her book, The Way of the Wild Goose. Beebe, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you and your amazing work.
Thank you. Absolutely. Anywhere you love buying your books, the books are widely distributed at your favorite bookstore or online, and book news and all about my books and essays and articles you can find on my website, which is beebebahrami.weebly.com, or just, go into a search engine, type my name, and you'll find my website.
Beebe, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of this wonderful work that you bring to our world.
Oh, Victor, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.